This is the first of two lectures on Apuleius's novel, The Golden Ass. Uh, I'm dividing it in two because there is in this wonderful, delightful novel that is almost, 1900 years old, arguably the oldest novel in the Western tradition, um, there is within that novel a novel within a novel. And the novel that is within that novel is the story of Psyche and Cupid. Now, these two stories echo one another. And Apuleius's retelling of the story of Psyche and Cupid has been handed down to us from antiquity. It's been the subject of many paintings and works of sculptures and works of art. He gives us a very vivid, lively tale about Psyche and Cupid. Now, for readers coming to Apuleius for the first time, you may wonder, what does the story of Psyche and Cupid have to do with the story of poor Lucius, who gets turned into an ass and then seeks throughout the rest of the novel to regain his human form? I think, as we're going to see, they have quite a lot to do with one another, because in effect, Lucius's story is an echo of the story of Psyche and Cupid. So we're going to start with the Psyche and Cupid story, and then we'll look at the story of poor Lucius, who becomes this ass who seeks throughout this very comical novel, but also one that has a didactic function, I think, to regain his human form. One of the reasons, though, we want to look at this story, we've been in a previous couple of lectures ago, we were talking about Plato and the Phaedrus and the Timaeus, and one of the themes that we've been following through is the question of the psyche or the soul, and we've seen how Eros, for instance, is part of the soul. Well, of course, Cupid is the name for the Roman or Latin name for Eros. Eros and Cupid are essentially the same deity. So when we talk about Eros and Psyche, we're talking about one of the themes that is really central to this set of concerns that we have as we're exploring the relation between animality and humanity. Now, the story of Lucius, which I'll be giving a second lecture on after this one, addresses more directly this question of man, and this Aristotelian definition is rational animal, or animal plus rationality equals man. And so the Golden Ass, in a more direct way, explores questions of human animality. But this story, too, of Psyche also addresses these kinds of issues as well, insofar as Psyche is as the story begins, is a mere mortal, a girl who is a girl like any others, but she finds immortality. And so what this story is also about, I think we're going to see, since Psyche is the word handed down to us for the soul itself, is what the story really is about. One of the questions we want to explore, in addition to the question of our relationship to our animality and this theme of animal metamorphosis that we've been following up, is how the concept of the immortal soul or immortal psyche is in effect born, which raises all kinds of interesting questions that we'll explore in the next lecture regarding, well, if there was no concept of the soul as immortal in any kind of metaphysical sense, in any sort of Platonic sense, what was the soul? What did people believe about the self prior to to Plato? And Plotinus, as we're going to see, is a Neo-Platonic thinker. It's very interesting because I think this novel is so important because it gives us a glimpse into the birth of the very concept of the immortal soul, one that we often think about as being just natural, but we don't really reflect often how the very concept of the psyche or the soul has a particular history that has been handed down to us. It didn't always exist. It didn't exist until somebody articulated it. And so this story is interesting for many different reasons. And I think if you haven't read Apuleius' The Golden Ass, it's a must read. It's a very foundational text. I put it right up there with Plato's Phaedrus in terms of understanding our basic human nature if you're a student of literature, but also, as we're going to see when we talk more directly about Lucius and his adventures, this is also a novel that has a great deal to teach us about the autobiographical genre, because this is arguably the first, not just the first novel. I mean, there's other novels like Daphnis and Chloe, also a wonderful tale also. And quasi novels that seem to be novels. And then we want to be careful about that because, like, for instance, if we think of it in Marxian, Hegelian terms, Hegel's going to say the novel is the bourgeois epic and link the rise of the novel to the rise of the middle class in Europe, and has a particular history in that sense as well. But there are novels that are pre-modern novels. And this is one of them, and it's one of the most delightful ones. And so it tells us about how the autobiography as a genre comes to be linked to the question of construction of self-identity. I think it's Frederick Jameson that's going to say the novel is a machine for constructing subjectivity. Well, that's an interesting way to put it, but that's what happens in this emergent genre as well. And so there's many reasons to read this wonderful novel. And so, but for today's lecture, I just want to focus on the first, this part of it. It may seem counterintuitive to start with the inset, but I'm going to start with the inset of the story of Cupid and Psyche, and then go from there to looking more directly at the plight of poor Lucius, the golden ass. Okay, so you can see here there is Cupid and Psyche they're wonderful representations of them in art. They are the first lovers. They fall in love, and so artists have been fascinated with depicting their love story. Okay, but we want to think about this. If we think about this in Platonic terms of two, we want to kind of keep this in mind. Cupid is Eros, the erotic, the god of eroticism, who shoots us with his arrows and makes us go crazy, as we saw in Plato's Phaedrus. Whereas Psyche, by contrast, comes to be the name associated with the soul, okay, with the Platonic idea of the soul as immortal. But of course, etymologically, when we look at this Greek word psyche, we see that prior to Plato, it's linked more to the idea of an animating life principle, spirit, breath. We're back to these kind of interesting concepts that we're exploring. Okay. All right. So who was Apuleius? You can see here he lived from 124 BC, or about 124 years after the birth of Christ, to 170. So he would have been, about 100 years after Christ died. He was born. And he was from Algeria. So it's interesting to note too, because I do work myself in African studies, and I find as a scholar of African literature that many of the themes that he explores in The Golden Ass are relevant even today, particularly related to questions of sorcery. And I think sometimes, we got to bear this in mind. We bifurcate what Edward Said calls Orientalism. We split the world in two, but the Roman world linked North Africa was just as linked to Europe. It was linked to Italy, and it was all part of one civilization. And so Apuleius, like Augustine, for instance, was also born in North Africa. Not far from where Apuleius was born. So these are North African writers. Augustine, for instance, was a Berber. So I think it's worth pausing on that, because I think we could justifiably describe Apuleius as an African writer, particularly given the fact that some of his themes, and his most important themes, are not just Platonic, but also African, and have enduring significance in understanding African culture today. And I think this novel can be used to better understand the culture of particularly, let's say, of Northwest Africa. We'll address this more. We'll come back to this when we look at the Tale of Lucius. But he wrote a number of works. These are just a few of them. The Florida is some of his speeches. He wrote specifically on Plato and his doctrine. So he was a Neo-Platonist. He wrote on the god of Socrates. Sometimes it's translated as the demon of Socrates. The demon of Socrates. This was a text that Saint Augustine of Hippo would later rebuke, even as Augustine was influenced by the Golden Ass in the writing of his Confessions, as he himself acknowledged. But Augustine was not comfortable with this idea of the demon of Socrates. This is something that Nietzsche follows as well. And in Heidegger, the Socrates demon is not as in like demonic as people as in like bad Hollywood films like The Exorcist. Well, Exorcist wasn't that bad of a film, but you know what I mean. It was the demon wasn't that kind of a demon. It was a demon that's more associated with what Heidegger will call a mood, modality of being. It's this when Socrates' moods would change, and this is what Apuleius is reflecting upon in this particular work. But we're going to be focused on the Golden Ass, which is obviously his most important and best known work. Okay, now as I said, Apuleius was a Neo-Platonist. Okay, so let's look at the dates here. You can see Plato lived from 428 to 347 BCE, or before Common Era. So if we look at Plotinus here from 204 to 270, who was a very prominent Neo-Platonist. You can see he was about 500 years after Plato. Apuleius was in the generation prior, about 100 years. He died about exactly, as you can see, 100 years before Plotinus did. And then Augustine was 354 to 430. Now, these three figures, Plotinus, Apuleius, and Augustine, are among the most prominent of the Neo-Platonists, who were writing, as you can see, anywhere between 500, 600 years after, in the case of Augustine, even 800 years, after Plato. So that's a long time. It's really a long time to think about. So even though Neo, of course, means new, so they're new Platonists, but they're definitely walking in the footsteps of Plato. And so we're very influenced in Western culture. Those of you from Western civilization, European civilization, the United States has, from where I'm teaching, has in addition to many other cultures that have influenced the culture of the United States, like Native American culture, for instance, it has this history as well, and so Augustine has exerted enormous influence upon us, and it's an influence that's linked or directly indebted to Plato, and I think this can't be emphasized enough. Now, if we had time, it would be interesting to go into this in more depth, but if for those of you that enjoy reading literature of this period, I would urge you to do a comparative reading of Augustine and Plotinus, and you can see how very similar their thought is, and yet Augustine is a Christian, and Plotinus is what Augustine would regard as a pagan. But so even though the pantheon of deities embraced by Plotinus is not the same as what is embraced by Augustine in his affirmation of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, it's nonetheless, his thinking is very similar to that of Augustine. And I think we're going to find as well that this is also true in the case of Apuleius. And we will explore this as we get further into our study. So just to review from our previous reading of Plato, we said that the Psyche, and the main character of this story is Psyche, is Plato divides into three parts. It's one soul, but with three parts. Logos, which we said is located in for Plato in the Timaeus in the head. This is reason, word, ego or I, different words for this. He also uses the metaphor of the charioteer, the chariot, and the logos would be the driver, the charioteer, the driver of the chariot. The two horses would be Thymos and Eros, or in the Timaeus, the Thymos is what's located in the heart, and Eros in the belly and the genitals. Thymos is what can be translated as spiritedness or courage, what in Freud becomes sort of the superego or the over I, this moral censor that I bear with, that is born within me, but also that causes us to feel anger and is what is the source of warfare in Plato. And then Eros, which is, appetite or desire. Sometimes, it appears as epithymia, but it means, whether it's food or sex, it's your desire for it or for what's out there. And so Eros, as we're going to see, this is one of the problems for Lucius, is he's oversexed. His libido is very strong, and his Eros is kind of out of control, and this is what is going to be one of the factors that jeopardize his humanity. We're going to say, for instance, as I quoted Saint Francis of Assisi, who called his body brother ass. Okay, I'm not sure if he was quoting Apuleius there, but it's that kind of idea. The body your animal body is like an ass. It's driven by its appetite, and we're going to see that this is going to be true. Certainly for Lucius, he's appetite driven. It's one of his problems, is he needs to awaken to reason. Okay, now Psyche, as we said, etymologically speaking, means breath, spirit, wind, air. It's the animating principle of life. If you heard the word anima, animation, it's linked to the idea of what animates. All right. So, but it becomes more because remember, spirit, or let's say the spoken word, is made up of wind and water, the fluids of the body, to put it in terms of Plato's four basic elements or four primal elements. But the spoken word as spirit is something that exists in the realm of becoming. And so Psyche has to become more than just something that exists in the realm of becoming. Psyche is going to become, let's say Psyche with a lowercase p is going to become Psyche with an uppercase p as an ideal, an immortal ideal. So how does this happen? The question we're going to explore here is, how does Psyche, or spirit and breath, become Psyche with a capital P, the Platonic ideal of the soul? All right, so that's one of the questions we want to bear in mind as we're investigating these texts. Okay, we want to keep in mind, as I said, this kind of compass that we're going to keep referring to as we examine particularly some of these Neo-Platonist works. Being, we said, is a transcendental realm of the truly existing intangible essence. We want to keep that in mind as we think about the goddess Venus, who figures prominently in this story, and then becoming which is the temporal realm of the five senses, is where the mortal girl Psyche, who finds her immortality, dwells. And she seems to be a goddess, but she's not a goddess as the tale begins. She's mistaken to be a goddess by the townspeople because of her great beauty, but she's merely a mortal girl in the realm of the five senses. And yet we're going to see also she's a kind of a doppelganger, a copy of the true queen of the beautiful, which is Venus in the Greek, who has the Greek name obviously of Aphrodite. All right, Cora, also we want to bear in mind is this question of non-being or non-existence. So just we want to bear these concepts in mind as we go through this material. Okay, so now here are some art from antiquity. As I said, many wonderful works of art inspired by these figures and directly by the tale of Apuleius, which has been read by so many for so many hundreds of years. Here you can see on the left, you see a statue of Eros, or Cupid. Eros is his Greek name, Cupid his Roman name, Aphrodite, who's the goddess of beauty, and Venus is her Roman name. Remember, in the Trojan War, one of the things that really was sort of the true reason for the Trojan War is Paris, who falls in love with Helen, is asked to give a golden apple to the goddess who he finds to be most beautiful, and he awards the the apple to Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty. So she's always, been linked to beauty. This is also one of the reasons why in the Iliad, Aphrodite is on the side of the Trojans in Paris. But okay, so she's a great beauty, and she has a son, and her son is Eros. So they're very closely related to one another. And it's interesting in Apuleius, the descriptions of the relationship between Venus and Cupid are often uncomfortable when there's passages where they seem to almost be making out. It makes, I think, many contemporary readers uncomfortable. But let's note also that that Cupid will inflict his mother as well will sting her with his arrows, as he will do with Zeus. So he's described as a kind of a naughty boy, a wanton naughty boy who goes around making people fall in love, and then as we saw in Plato's Phaedrus, once they fall in love, they do really dumb things. But as Socrates tells us, this is the greatest gift that the gods bestow upon us. This little wanton boy is the very deity that Socrates apologizes to in Phaedrus for his offense against him. Okay, now Psyche and Venus, all right, this very interesting relationship we're going to want to explore between them. Okay, so on the far left, you see a painting of Psyche. This is actually at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And you've seen in the history of art, you see many images quite similar to this. So she's a great beauty, but she's a mortal. All right, on the far right, you see Venus, who is the goddess of beauty, but she is the goddess of immortal beauty. In the middle, this is a famous painting of Psyche, who is undergoing these trials, and we're going to see, and that's Pan, the goat man, part goat, the tutor of Eros, and he consoles her at one point in the narrative. And here we're going to see that it's interesting to know that the Psyche, that the mortal girl, before she can become immortal, has to go through many, many trials. And this tells us something about, I think, the history of the development of this concept of the immortal soul is that the immortal soul didn't just come into being overnight. It had to go through many trials, much like Psyche, before it came to be this sort of hegemonic idea that we assume to have always existed, but we need to sort of think about it historically in terms of the historical development of a concept. All right. So here she's going through these trials. As we're going to see, her trials are very similar to the trials of Lucius, who is turned into an ass in the novel. Okay, so here's the story that Apuleius tells us. So we want to focus for a minute on the sensuous and temporal beauty of Psyche. So since the mortal girl, Psyche, exists in the realm of becoming, she is a sensual girl in the sense that she partakes of the five senses. She inhabits the world of the senses, and this is the world of time as well. She's not outside of time in the way that Venus is. And so beauty in the world of becoming is something that is fleeting, right? It appears for a moment and then it's gone. But so she is quite lovely, and she's so lovely that people begin to fall in love with her, or at least just in awe of her, because they've never seen a mortal girl who has her beauty. So here's what Apuleius tells us. In a certain city there lived a king and a queen with three notably beautiful daughters. The two elder ones were very attractive, yet praise thought appropriate to humans was sufficient for their fame. Okay, now note here too, I'm not going to go through all the details of the story, but these are two very wicked sisters. I get this idea like Cinderella, the two wicked stepsisters. So here are these two sisters, and they're very envious of Psyche, and they plot her downfall. They're going to tell her later that Eros, who's fallen in love with her, Cupid, who's fallen in love with her, is a horrible monster. Of course, he's not. They do everything they can to get back at her just for the mere fact that she's prettier than they are. But this leads to their undoing as well. But Psyche doesn't know who to trust, and for a while she listens to her sisters, and this is partly what leads to her problem. her downfall, what causes her to, was the inauguration of the trials that she undergoes. Okay. All right. The beauty of the youngest sister was so special and distinguished that our poverty of human language could not describe or even adequately praise it. In consequence, many of her fellow citizens and hordes of foreigners revered her with devoted worship as if she were none other than Venus herself. All right, so she becomes a doppelganger, which is to say she's a double. She seems to be Venus, but she's not. Okay, so let's remember that what exists in the realm of becoming is the world for Plato of shadows. It's the world of seeming, the world of appearing, as opposed to the world of being. So she seems to be Venus herself, but she's not Venus herself. She's a doppelganger, a copy or a double of Venus. And so remember, there's seeming and there's being. There's what appears to be, and then there's what is. And so Psyche is what appears to be, Venus, but Venus is actually the true deity. Okay, so rumor had already spread through the nearest cities and bordering territories that the goddess was sprung from the dark blue depths of the sea and was nurtured by the foam from the frothing waves, was now bestowing the favor of her divinity, to be Venus, among random gatherings of common folk, or at any rate that the earth rather than the sea was newly impregnated by heavenly seed and had sprouted forth a second Venus, invested with the bloom of virginity. All right. Sacrifices at the shrines of the actual goddess Venus were postponed. Shrines grew unsightly. Couches became threadbare. Rites went unperformed. The statues were not garlanded, and the altars were bare and grimy with gold ashes. It was the girl, Psyche, who was entreated with prayer. Okay, so now you've got, this is blasphemy, right? I mean, they're praying, the people are praying not to Venus, they're praying to a mere girl. Okay, so this is a problem. And this is going to be, this would upset all of the gods, but it's going to be especially upsetting to Venus. She doesn't like this at all. Okay, what is hers has been what is rightfully hers is being neglected. The veneration that is due to her is being ignored. Okay, since divine honors were being diverted in this excessive way to the worship of a mortal girl, the anger of the true Venus was fiercely kindled. She could not control her irritation. "Here I am," she said, "the ancient mother of the universe, the founding creator of the elements, the Venus that tends the entire world, compared to share the glory of my majesty with a mortal maiden." Okay, now note there, she says, "Here I am, the ancient mother of the universe." Okay, that's an important passage to pause on there, because we're going to see, for instance, when Lucius becomes, when he finally has his true human shape restored to him, and Venus is going to appear to him. She's going to tell him, "I have many names. And then she says her true name is going to be Isis. Remember, Egypt is the mother of the world. So she goes back, very far. But there are other. The goddess goes by many names, but this is the actual mother of the world. And so this is an offense to her, and she's going to get what is coming to her. Okay, as we will see. Okay. Okay. Am I then to share with another the supplications of my divine power? Am I to endure vague adoration by proxy? In other words, by way of a mere copy of me or the ideal, allowing a mortal girl to strut around playing my double? All right, so interesting way of putting it. She sees that they are venerating her, but it is through a representation of her, not her herself. And this is not adequate for her. It's not enough. And so this is a problem that's going to have to be dealt with. And so she summons the wanton boy, her son Cupid, and is going to instruct him to go down there and correct the problem. And the way she's going to do this is ask Cupid to make her fall, use his arrows, and make Psyche, this impertinent girl, become love stricken, or to fall in love with the most hideous of all men imaginable. All right, so things don't go the way that Venus had expected, because what's going to happen is that when Cupid goes down there and sees Psyche, he falls in love with her himself. Well, there's the archetypally classic situation of, it's not his mother, but she's a dead ringer for his mother, and so he falls in love with somebody else, and this is not something that makes his mother particularly happy, but it's a very kind of classically Oedipal situation, because Psyche is for him a kind of a mother substitute that he is love stricken with. So Cupid falls in love with Psyche, and then we're going to see Psyche falls in love with Cupid, or since Psyche is Eros, since Cupid is Eros, Psyche is going to fall in love with Eros, which is another way to say she's going to fall in love with love itself, which is an interesting plight. Okay. Venus at once summoned her son, that winged and indiscreet youth, whose own bad habits show his disregard for public morality. He's always creating these scandals. He goes rampaging through people's houses at night, armed with his torch and arrows, undermining the marriages of all. He gets away scot-free with this behavior, and nothing that he does is worthwhile. And so Venus says to Cupid, see that girl Psyche is seized with consuming passion for the lowest possible specimen of humanity, for one who, as the victim of fortune, has lost status, inheritance, and security, a man so disreputable that nowhere in the world can he find an equal in wretchedness. All right, so she's to fall in love with the low of the low, the lowest man imaginable. And so this is also, some people say that the story, I see you have a little image there, Beauty and the Beast, that this story is the prototype of the story of Beauty and the Beast, because Psyche's going to also imagine that Cupid is a kind of a beast that she has fallen in love with, even though, as we'll see, when they that Psyche, Cupid, since he is immortal, remains invisible to her for the first part of their marriage. But her sisters convince her that she's fallen in love with a hideous monster, as Venus had in fact would have hoped for her. All right, so here again is some wonderful art that you'll see of Cupid and Psyche, and I just encourage you to do web searches and look at some of this art, which is so nice that you can see through the ages. Okay, so now let's note that Cupid, the descriptions that we get of Cupid and Eros are as aspirated, as in Phaedrus, are aspirated breath. Now, we talked about this with Socrates, just to refresh your memory, when we said this, when Socrates was close to Phaedrus and he felt this erotic attraction for Phaedrus, he became more eloquent in his speech as he was, the more inspired that he was by the presence of Phaedrus. All right, so Eros is sexual attraction, but it's also linked, again, to the wind that blows. All right, the inspiration that has an erotic component to it. Eloquence for Plato comes because one is sexually aroused. All right, so Eros, Cupid, is linked to the question of voice or spirit, the wind that blows. So it's in the case of Phaedrus, it's the presence of Phaedrus that gets the wind blowing for Socrates. And so we want to think of Cupid as Eros as a kind of a wind or a spirit that blows. All right. Psyche could see no living soul and merely heard words emerging from thin air. Psyche's husband was invisible to her. All right, so he's like the word itself, invisible, but but I mean, he can't be seen. But there's something that's there, but it can't be visually apprehended. Okay, Psyche's curiosity. Now, when her sisters tell her that she's married to a monster, they lie to her because they're envious, because they have no idea either. They're just trying to, be evil, envious, jealous sisters, as sisters often are. She says, well, that she begins to loathe the monster. She says, well, the monstrous dragon that she believes her husband to be from listening to her envious sisters, but she loved the husband even though they were one and the same. Now, I should note, just going back a bit, for those of you who have not read this, what happens is she is taken down to a cave at the bottom of a sharp cliff, and this is where she finds this house for her that Cupid has prepared for her, and she has attendants who wait upon her, but she lives among entities that are invisible, and Cupid is one of these invisible entities. So she's living alone at the bottom of this cliff in this cave, and this is her sisters. She invites them to come and see her, and this wind, a gust of wind, brings them down to the cave, just as it brought her down. And so after her sisters left and they've filled her ears with this poison about the monstrous nature of her husband, she determines to kill her husband. And so she uncovers the lamp when he's asleep after they've had sex, and she seizes the razor to kill him. She shows, we're told, a boldness that belied her sex. But as soon as the lamp was brought near and the secrets of the couch revealed, she beheld, we're told, of all the beasts, the gentlest and sweetest, Cupid himself, a handsome god, lying in a handsome posture. So now she sees that he's not a hideous beast. He's in fact a wonderfully handsome man, and he's in fact so beautiful that she's awestruck at the vision, and she loses all self-control. She's like the Socratic man who caught a glimpse of the beloved that we read about in the Phaedrus. She is in love, but it gets worse for her. As Psyche trained her gaze insatiably with no little curiosity on her husband's weapons. Now let's pause. I want to pause there for just a moment before going too much further on that word curiosity. So what's going to happen here is he has quivers in his bow, and she realizes, oh my gosh, this is Eros or Cupid, and she sees the quiver. She takes one of the arrows out and she touches it, and it causes her to become she's even more madly in love than she was before, and when she was merely awestricken, because now she's in love with love, because she's glazed herself with the same arrow of Cupid. And this is disastrous for her. But what makes it disastrous, especially, and this is where we need to think about when we get to the tale of Lucius, is her curiosity. It's precisely her curiosity that constantly gets her in trouble, just as it's Lucius's curiosity. Lucius is curious about two things, especially sex. He's driven by sex, his desire to have sex. He's oversexed. And also he's curious. He's particularly curious about sorcery, and it's his curiosity that gets him into trouble. Now, if we go back to our basic Platonic distinction between true knowledge, which is like the knowledge that philosophers have, which is, we said, like the asking of the question is first in rank. Why are there beings at all rather than nothing? Like we said, philosophers ask questions. Philosophers do philosophy; they philosophize. Animals have curiosity. So the curiosity is not the same thing as doing philosophy. So curiosity is part of our animal nature. Again, like a dog smelling a scent, as opposed to truly reflective questioning. And so what gets Psyche into trouble, just like Lucius, and this is one of the reasons why these two stories echo one another, is her excessive curiosity. Okay. And she tested it on the point of her thumb, with the result being that it pricked too deeply, and tiny drops of rose red blood bedewed the surface of the skin. So all unknowing and without prompting, Psyche fell in love with love. And note I put there in small love with uppercase love. She fell in love with love. She's in a world of trouble now. But while her wounded heart pounded on being roused by such striking beauty, the lamp disgorged a drop of burning oil from the tip of its flame upon the god's right shoulder. And this causes Cupid to wake up. He says, basically tells her, normally you pay for your life for this, but I'm only going to punish you because I love you. I'm only going to punish you by you now have lost the right to be in my presence. And he leaves. And so now she's alone, and he's wounded, and he goes up to heal from his wound. Love has wounded him as well. Love is often a wound, or love hurts, as the song goes. And Psyche now is in trouble, and she's going to be especially in more trouble because now, Eros Cupid's been gone for a while, and people are aware of his absence. This has caused all kinds of problems because remember, Eros is essential to all human relationships, and he's been off, with his new bride, and Venus is going to get wind of it, and so now she's going to be very angry because she wanted this girl to be punished. Instead, her own beloved son has fallen in love with this girl who she wanted punished. Okay, so let's let me push this here. Just 1 second. We'll go to this and then the next image. Okay. Meanwhile, the entire house of Venus was in bad odor, the object of gossip and rebuke on the lips of people everywhere. They were claiming that Cupid was relaxing with a lady of easy virtue in the mountains, and that Venus herself was idly swimming in the ocean, with the result that pleasure and favor and elegance had disappeared from the world. All was unkempt, rustic, uncouth. There were no weddings, no camaraderie between friends, none of the love which children inspire. Now note here, we saw this in Socrates, this very same idea in the Phaedrus, that, remember when we looked at the argument of Lucius, this fallacious argument, what Lucius said is, when he advanced this friends for benefit type thinking, he was impugning the god Eros, and what Socrates is going to say, yeah, Eros is a problem, as we've already seen, because it can make us do crazy things, but it is also a blessing. And so the idea here is that a world without Eros is a very dreary, bleak world, because Eros is present in all relationships. Eros circulates in the world, and it is what, in terms of what Freud will call the pleasure principle. It's not just some kind of supplement that is unessential. It's a deeply essential part of our being in the way that it's being presented here. And so without it, as we see here, there aren't even any friendships, no camaraderie anymore, no weddings, no love between friends, none of the love which children inspire. The world has become an ugly place in the absence of Eros or Cupid. A world of boundless squalor, unsavory tedium, and sordid alliances, like Game of Thrones or something. Such was the gossip whispered in Venus's ear, tearing her son's reputation to shreds. And Venus was absolutely livid. She burst out, "So my son has a girlfriend." Has he? All right, well, there's mom. And she is not happy. Okay? And so Psyche gets wind of this, and eventually she decides that she better just surrender to Venus. Venus is going to catch her sooner or later, and so she'll be better off if she just turns herself over, and maybe Venus will be merciful because there's no escaping her anyway. And so when she arrives, Venus says to her, "Oh, so you finally condescended to greet your mother-in-law, have you? Or is the purpose of this visit to see your husband, whose life is in danger from the wound which you inflicted. You can rest assured that I shall welcome you as a good mother-in-law should. And then she added, where are my maids, melancholy and sorrow? So there's again, archetypal situation of mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, who often don't get along very well. And Venus is she says, now that you're here, I'm going to make your life miserable. And so she, to try to win the favors of Venus, Psyche has to do all these tasks. Okay, and this is one of the interesting things that the trials of Psyche, or she's undergoing these trials in order to win the affection, the care, the favor of Venus, and the tasks that Venus give her are crazy and difficult. Now, this is also the very same situation we're going to see with Lucius, is that he needs to win the favor of the goddess whom he has mocked. Okay, because he's only been interested he's only been interested in what appears to be true and apparent beauty. He's never considered the eternal beauty, and so he has to appease the goddess Venus, whom he has offended. And the same really is true for Psyche. She needs to win the affection of Venus. All right. So another way to say this is that before the immortal soul can be born, before Psyche with a big P, with a small p, can become Psyche with a big P, Venus has to come to love Psyche. All right. She has to find a way to love Psyche. And so Psyche has to do everything that she can to win the affection of Venus. And so, but Venus sends her on these very difficult, terrible trials, which she has almost no possibility of succeeding at, except that she's helped out along the way. Now, I won't go through all the trials, but I do want to mention a couple of them that are most important, or one or two. So the trials of Psyche, we're going to call this, or how the human soul gains immortality. So of all these injunctions, when she goes down to Hades in one of these trials, and she's warned, she's told to bring back this box that has this treasure of divine beauty hidden within it, and bring it back to Venus. So she does the impossible. She goes to Hades, which is the land that nobody's supposed to return from unless you're, say, Persephone. But she's warned when she goes to Hades that when she gets this box that has this sort of beauty potion in it, that to bring it back to her mother-in-law, Venus, but do not be inquisitive about the treasure of divine beauty hidden within it. Again, her problem is curiosity, because once Psyche was back in the light of the world after being in Hades, and she had reverently hailed it, her mind was dominated, we're told, by rash curiosity. How stupid I am to be carrying this beauty lotion fit for deities, she says, and not a single drop of it for myself. For with this, at any rate, I can be pleasing to my beautiful lover. Now, so she wants to she says, look, I can, this will make Cupid happy, because I'll even be more beautiful if I get this divine potion. And the words were scarcely out of her mouth when she opened the box, but inside there was no beauty lotion or anything other than the sleep of Hades. All right, so this puts her right to sleep. Okay, so now no, this is something we'll come back to when we talk about the story of Lucius, because again, it's linked to this idea that she thinks there's going to be some kind of substance in the box. She's looking for a mere potion, and when she opens it up, there's nothing there. It puts her right to sleep. The beauty potion itself proves to be illusory. So we want to think about this in terms of substance, what the idea of substance, and we'll talk more about the question of magic, what magic was, like a magic potion, a poison, what it meant in the ancient world. And we're going to see, is when we look at the Lucius part of this story, how poisons are deeply interconnected with the question of sorcery itself, linked to the ancient culture of sorcery, which is of Egypto-African culture and Egypto-African religion, that is replete, for instance, in a text like on the Book of the Dead, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, Egyptian books of the dead. And those are very different. The ideas about words and self are very different in this far older culture that the Platonic world comes to supplant. When, for instance, the Greeks in the time of Alexander were going to colonize ancient Egypt, as well as much of North Africa. Okay. So now is the time finally for Cupid's intervention. He's recovering from his wound. His wound is finally healed, and he longs for Psyche. He can't bear to be parted from her any longer. So he glides out of the high set of the window of the chamber, which was his prison, and he finds Psyche. There she is, asleep from her curiosity, once again, her foolish curiosity, her animal curiosity, and he rouses her, Psyche, with an innocuous prick of his arrow, and he says to her, "Poor dear Psyche, see how, as before, your curiosity might have been your undoing." All right, and it should have been her undoing, except for the intervention of, Cupid. So again, we have this opposition. Curiosity there's curiosity killed the cat. Curiosity is what animals experience. Curiosity is part of your nature, your mortal nature, perhaps your animal nature, just like as is true for your dog or your cat. But if you want to start thinking about the immortal, you got to do more than be curious. You have to push beyond mere animal curiosity. All right, now at this point, Jupiter, who is Zeus, intervenes, and he said enough is enough. And he says, he makes this decree. He says, look, I've decided that the hot-headed impulse of Cupid's early youth need to be reined in. He has been the subject of enough notoriety in day-to-day gossip. He has chosen, and remember, Cupid also strikes Jupiter with his arrows. He has chosen the girl and robbed her of her virginity. So he must have and hold her. Let him take Psyche in his embrace and enjoy his dear one ever after. And then he tells Venus, you deal with it, get used to it, you'll come to love her in time. Again, classic situation of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. There and then he ordered that Psyche be detained and brought to heaven through Mercury's agency. This would be, again, Thoth in the Greek tradition, or Hermes in the Thoth in the Egyptian tradition, Hermes in the Greek tradition. And he gave her a cup of ambrosia and said, "Take this, Psyche, and become immortal. Cupid will never part from your embrace. This marriage of yours will be eternal." And so Psyche was wed to Cupid, and at full term, a daughter was born to them. We call her Pleasure. All right? So the wedding of Psyche and Cupid is to be an immortal wedding. Psyche will then henceforth never part from Cupid, and Psyche then ceases to be a mere girl, but she becomes a god like Cupid, or she finds immortality. Okay, so another way we can say this is that Psyche, small case p, becomes Psyche, uppercase P, or the human soul, the immortal soul, immortal Psyche. The Psyche becomes immortal. It is born. It comes into being, which implies that wasn't always the case, and we know from studying the literature of the ancient world that there was not always a Platonic concept of Psyche. This is the reason, for instance, why in the Torah, the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, arguably we can see that that there's no concept of the immortal soul in the way that that Christians often think of it, and that's evident in these texts. Not until you get to the scripture known as the Gospels or the New Testament, but that reflects a period after Palestine was Hellenized. Prior to its Hellenization, it's not altogether clear that in, let's say, the Hebraic texts that are handed down to us, that there is a concept of an immortal soul, at least not articulated in Platonic terms. This is a late development. All right, so what I'm calling here what I'm calling here is the Proto-Trinitarian logic of Apuleius. Now we said that Apuleius, like Plotinus, has a kind of a Trinitarian logic in his thinking. It's just that the God for him is not a Christian God. In fact, Apuleius was very hostile to Christianity. And some people even thought that the golden ass was an attack on Christianity because because Christianity was sweeping through the ancient world at this time, and he was certainly aware of it. But his awareness of it seems to be pretty sketchy, because he thought that Christians worshipped a god that they thought the Christians worshipped an ass man, or a kind of like a figure like Lucius himself, a kind of a half man, half donkey, and it was kind of a distorted idea, but that was kind of one of the rumors that were circulating. But if we think of Apuleius as a Neo-Platonist thinker, much like Augustine was a Neo-Platonist thinker, we can sort of see how the Trinitarian logic that becomes church doctrine at the Council of Nicaea in 325 is anticipated in the logic of Apuleius in this narrative. So if we think of, like, say, Venus as the immortal goddess who exists in the realm of being, if I drew here a little circle here on the that's cut in half, which I also like to use to talk about philosophers like Hegel, that Venus would be we could put her on the left side of the circle. We could put Psyche as the doppelganger on the right side. We could think of Venus as the being in a transcendental, eternal sense in terms of our basic concepts of metaphysics. Psyche, the double in the realm of becoming. And we could think of Cupid is love for Psyche, and so it's the whole is the concept of the soul. Now, to put this in terms that might be more familiar for those of you coming from a Christian tradition, they get the doctrine of the Trinity. You have the Father in heaven, you have the Son, who is the incarnation of the Father, and then you have the Holy Spirit, which is the love of the Father for the Son. But the concept of the Trinity in Christian theology is not it's not three gods. It's just one God with three parts. And the same really is true of this kind of what I'm calling your Proto-Trinitarian logic of Apuleius. The immortal soul, it's one soul, but it has these different components to it. And it's very similar to what we see in the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay. Now, note here, just briefly in passing, we're going to talk about Freud a little bit later and further in a lecture down the road. And Freud is going to distinguish between what he calls healthy narcissism, which is called sort of healthy self-love, or secondary narcissism, and kind of a narcissism which becomes, kind of a sickly, obsessive interest in oneself. Here's Narcissus staring at his pool, his reflection in the pool. And so Narcissus is love of self. And so we could say, well, Psyche is the representation of Venus. And so Psyche Venus has to love Psyche. Venus has to find a way to love Psyche. So there's a sense what I'm calling narcissism here is not a pejorative term, not in the way Freud thinks of it, but as a necessary. We have to love ourselves before we can have a self at all. That's, I think, part of what the lesson of this story is the necessity of self-love, as opposed to what, say, someone like Derrida will call, autoimmunity, which would be the rejection of the image of oneself. And so this is a story about narcissism in some ways, but I'm not using that as a pejorative concept, but as a valorized concept. Okay. So, right. So in closing here, just a few questions for review. We want to ask ourselves, well, how in this story, how does the soul become immortal in the golden ass? All right. This is, I think, an important thing to consider. And we'll look at this with respect to Lucius as well, and how he finds salvation. In what ways is the idea of the soul or psyche in Apuleius indebted to Plato's idea of the soul, as articulated in Timaeus and Phaedrus? Clarify with reference to the basic concepts of metaphysics. Okay. Now, I would add to this as something else to think about, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the Lucius part of the story. What is new about the Platonic and Neo-Platonic idea of the self become soul or psyche? For instance, how is it different from ancient Egypto-African notions of the self? And so I just put here something to kind of put an asterisk by and think about. On the left, I have an image of a burning pyre. On the right, I have the image of a mummy. Now, if you note these differences in burial practices, they reflect differences in orientation to the idea of what the self is, and they're very revealing, because, for instance, for the Greeks, as we said, when we talked about Plato's Phaedrus, the immortal soul was the oyster in the oyster shell, and once the body's dead, you can just burn it up and it's gone. But the Egyptians, since they didn't really have an idea of being in any sort of Platonic sense, or the idea of the soul as being immortal in the same way as in the Platonic sense, as it partaking of some other transcendental ideal realm, of which this world is a mere representation. They did everything they can to make sure that the bodies lingered as long as possible, because the body itself, as well as the name, the heart, the shadow, and so on, were all parts of the self, or what we might call sort of the Osiris of man, which becomes dismembered and then remembered. So for the Egyptians, since there was no other world, there was just this world that we inhabit. They wanted to do everything they could to linger in this world. And so these practices, these burial practices, they tell us a lot of revealing things that are worth reflecting upon. Okay, so we want to be aware of differing conceptions of the erotic, the orgiastic secret, as we called it, from Derrida and Plato, Apuleius, Euripides, and Augustine, although we're not reading Augustine, but I note that because in the Pauline Christian tradition, which we've been referring to, in which is going, like, for instance, Augustine's going to, even though he's, as he tells us many, many times, driven by his sexual desire for women, he's going to nonetheless become chaste and embrace vows of chastity, which would have been unimaginable, really, in say the thinking of someone like Euripides, and certainly in the thinking of the ancient world in a more broad sense. So, and how in these different thinkers is the question of eros, or the erotic, linked to animality? These are questions we'll also want to continue to pursue. So that concludes this lecture. It will be followed by another lecture that will focus also on the golden ass, but specifically on the part of the story focused on the trials of Lucius.